The views expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of this station. Welcome to Insights into Northeast Michigan. This is a Channel 11 News public affairs program dealing with the issues affecting those in the community as well as Northeast Michigan and the state. And now, Insights.
Welcome to Insights. I'm Annie Taylor. Today we are sitting down with Jim Fisher, the Resource Protection Manager of the Forest Resource Division of the DNR.
Correct.
Okay, I got it. I'm almost there. So will you explain a little bit about the DNR, or especially your role within the DNR?
My job with the DNR as Resource Protection Manager is all within the fire program, wildland fire. And I'm responsible for the program in the Lower Peninsula, where we have 34 offices and fire officers across the state and forestry staff that fight fire on wildland fires, forest fires.
Will you give a little background about the DNR and then how your division got started?
Sure. The fire program in particular started back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when the logging era was going on, all the lumbering. With large fires across the state during the early 1900s, hundreds of thousands of acres, even in the Lower Peninsula across the Thumb and areas there, and it killed people and burnt property and homes, and it was very devastating. So in 1902, the first forest fire law went into effect, and then in 1917, the first state fire warden was hired. And from there, the program has grown to the offices and the fire program we have now. Historically, we've had 140 fire officers across the state. Currently, we're at about 70 because of budget issues. But we have offices throughout the Upper Peninsula and the Lower Peninsula, all the way down to Oakland County near Detroit.
Wow. Mm-hmm. What's the difference, do you feel, about the Upper Peninsula and you work in the Lower Peninsula of maybe the fires or how your department is, works? Mm-hmm. Is there a difference?
There is a little bit of difference. Our firefighting philosophy is the same across the state, but the UP is much more remote than the Lower Peninsula. Some parts of the Lower Peninsula, especially here in the Northeast, it is fairly remote also, but we have better access to the area down here, so our ability to get to the fires faster and people seeing the fires faster and reporting them faster is better. But we also have more fires because we have more people out in the woods in the Lower Peninsula. So
I wouldn't have, now that you've said that,
mm-hmm.
that makes sense, but because the Upper Peninsula is so rural, they must start most of them on their own.
The UP probably has more lightning-caused fires than we do in the Lower Peninsula, but in the state, probably 98% of the fires are human-caused fires. Debris burning, equipment, power lines, those kinds of things. The fire we're going to talk about later, the Duck Lake fire, was caused by lightning and in kind of a remote area. So
I did not know that. Mm-hmm. So the Lower Peninsula is mostly caused because there's so many people living down here. Mm-hmm. Do you feel that with burning permits, those fires can aggravate or make more fires?
Well, with burn permits, as long as folks get burn permits or call to get a burn permit and understand what the fire danger is for the day, it actually reduces fire activity, because people will only burn when they can get a permit, and that's on lower days when it's not going to be as bad of a fire day. So I think burn permits are very important for the prevention of fires, but it doesn't stop equipment fires where people are, where you have power lines and there's equipment operating out in the woods, trucks and ORVs and those kinds of things that do occasionally cause fires.
Going back to your role a little bit, what do you do on a day-to-day basis or on a weekly basis when there might not be a huge fire going on?
Mm-hmm. My role is to manage the program in the Lower Peninsula, but one of my roles also is as a duty officer. There's 3 of us in the Lower Peninsula that function as a duty officer, and we have to make sure there's resources available for fires when they happen, and just to be ready. One of the big things we do is we do training within our own organization. We train with fire departments and with other cooperators such as the U.S. Forest Service. We're always working on our equipment, making sure it's ready to go. Those kinds of things are the things we do in the non-fire times.
Right, and earlier we talked about, before the show started, how there are different divisions within the DNR, and you are just one of many. Will you explain that a little bit more?
Certainly. Within the DNR, there's, I'm not sure exactly how many divisions, but there's Parks and Recreation Division. They do state parks and waterway access sites and state forest campgrounds. There's Fisheries Division that manages the fish within the state on the Great Lakes and on inland waters and rivers. Law Division that enforces the state game laws and other laws. Wildlife Division that manages wildlife programs, you know, all the habitat for wildlife, and you know, up here a big thing would be the elk, you know, so they manage those kinds of things. We work with those divisions. When we're managing the state forest, part of our job is to manage the state forest. We have foresters that do that, and those folks work closely, especially with Wildlife and Fish Division and others, to make sure we're managing the forest to provide activity out there for recreation, to provide hunting and habitat for you know, game and wildlife, and to provide timber for the timber industry. That's a big industry in the state, is to provide timber. It's a big economic thing within the state, so we make sure we work on all that.
So who do you feel, and maybe this is a broad question, but who do you work closely with, mostly in the divisions of the DNR?
I think in the Forest Resource Division, we're pretty much married up with Wildlife Division because we manage the land for forestry and wildlife and recreation. So Wildlife Division is a big part of what our division works with. Within the fire program, we work closely with Law Division to enforce the forest fire laws, and you know, if somebody starts a fire, they can get a ticket for that, and then they have to pay suppression costs. So we work closely with Law Division on that. And then we also work with other agencies like the U.S. Forest Service on fire activities. Do
you work closely with the city fire department at all, or the township fire department?
Certainly, the local fire departments within the area, so we have an office here in Alpena, and our fire officer there does training with the local fire departments. When the fire department gets called out to a grass fire or a forest fire, we usually go out and help them with that. If it's a big enough fire, sometimes we take charge and they work with us. Other times they're in charge and we work with them, depending on the situation. So
do you see when there are larger fires in the lower peninsula, does the city fire department ever come and help you guys, or vice versa? Do you guys ever help them with fires?
Both ways, actually. We're primarily forest fire, wildland fire. We don't have the kind of equipment that a city fire department would have. We can't go into house fires, those kinds of things. And they don't have bulldozers and the kind of equipment we have to go out on the wildland fires. So we work together on those things. If they needed water, or if they had a structure fire that was starting to get into the woods, we would go and help with that. And if we're out in the woods fighting a fire, they help us they have some equipment that can get off-road, but they help us by supplying water and having personnel to help us on fires too. So it works both ways.
Well, when we come back, I would like to discuss the Duck Lake fire and also other extensive fires that have been happening this year.
Sure.
And then maybe your role within those. So stay with us and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Insights. I'm sitting here with Jim Fisher. So Jim, when we left off before, we were just describing the history of the DNR and your role within it. But I want to get into now the fires. And you've mentioned before that not all fires are bad. Some are what you call prescribed fires. Will you explain that?
Certainly. We do what we call prescribed burning, and that's where a piece of land is looked at, and the people that manage the land, whether it's the forestry staff, wildlife staff, or park staff, and they decide that some of the best management there might be to burn that so that we can either regenerate the forest or create habitat for wildlife or remove an invasive species such as Phragmites along the lakeshore. We burn to remove those kinds of things also. So those prescribed fires are written, a plan is written up for those burns, and we follow that plan so that it's safe. We don't lose the fire, it doesn't escape and get away, and we're trying to meet the objective that the land manager wanted for that particular site so that it can be the type of forest or ground or grassland that they want. the southern part of the state was oak savannas and prairies years and years ago. And so we're trying to restore some of that native ecosystem, and some of that involves burning. We burn right down around the city of Detroit and Monroe.
Wow.
And out on Lake St. Clair. We burn up here in the hardwoods and in the pine. The Kirtland warbler is an endangered bird that we burn for. For instance, we burn for elk habitat too.
When are those times? Is there a set time of when you guys burn, or do prescribed burning, or is it, when you guys feel it's necessary, or?
It depends on the prescription and what the objective of the burn is. If we're burning, say for warm season grasses, we may burn later in the year or earlier in the year, depending on what we're burning for. If we're burning for Kirtland warbler management in the jack pine, we usually try to burn that in the spring. If we're burning for opening maintenance, we can burn that most any time of the year, other than, of course, the winter. But we do burn cattails and phragmites in the wintertime for duck management, for duck habitat.
What's phragmites?
Phragmites?
Phragmites.
It's an invasive species. You're familiar with cattails, and they're tall. Phragmites is taller than cattails. It grows in the wetlands, and it's pretty much taking over the habitat from cattails and eliminating cattails in some areas. Well, for ducks and geese and stuff, they want the cattails. That's what they prefer to live in and nest in and stuff. So we need to get rid of the invasive species and bring the native species back, and that's what Phragmites is, an invasive species.
How do you do that without burning the
cattails?
The cattails.
It's okay to burn the cattails because they actually regenerate better.
Oh, okay.
And generally what happens with the Phragmites is we spray it first and kill it, and then we burn the tops, because the tops have the seeds in it, so we burn it over, and so it doesn't reseed itself. And sometimes it takes 2 or 3 tries at that to get it all.
I think that's a misconception, at least for me, that fires, kill everything so nothing can regenerate, but that's prescribed burning helps that regeneration and almost that healthy growth for the environment, which is interesting.
Exactly. Up here in this part of the state, for the elk, we actually burn areas to regenerate a certain type of forest ecosystem just for the elk, and help to help the habitat for the elk, so the elk do better.
Wow. Now moving into the big fires.
Bad fires.
I think mostly I know that we've covered here at the news the UP fire and how extensive that was, and what was it, over 21,000 acres?
Correct.
And almost 50 homes were destroyed.
Exactly.
So will you tell me a little bit more about that?
That fire exactly was over 21,000 acres. It was started by lightning. The day before this fire, there were 4 fires north of Newberry that were started by lightning. And one of them grew too large, and the second day it was real windy, and this fire took off and ran to become 21,000 acres. It burnt, I think it was 12 miles in something like 2-3 hours. It's just incredible rate of spread on this fire, and there's no way you're going to get in front of a fire like that. So we evacuate people, we try to protect the private property, we try to keep the fire as narrow as we can by flanking it with our equipment. Access was difficult up there because it's more remote. And it did burn 49 cabins and homes, a motel, and a store, plus multiple outbuildings, garages and sheds and things. But yeah, so that's very devastating to the community, to the people that own that property and live there. They have family memories in those homes and cabins, and that's gone.
What was your role within that, especially, obviously you still need to take care of the Lower Peninsula, even though, they probably needed extra hands up there.
They sure did, and that's part of my job as a duty officer and a resource protection manager in the Lower Peninsula, is to make sure we're covered here, but to help them. So we did send quite a few fire staff and forestry staff that can fight fire and equipment to the Duck Lake fire over a 2-week, 3-week period. We also received help from Wisconsin and Minnesota on those fires, and the National Guard. Minnesota sent a couple of air tankers to drop water. The National Guard had some helicopters that they brought up to help us drop water and do intelligence or recon on the fire. And then Wisconsin sent some bulldozers and some firefighters over. We have agreements with the other states neighboring us, actually even with Canada, Ontario and Manitoba. It's called the Great Lakes Forest Fire Compact, so we share resources. So we brought some of those folks in, and we were having fires down here during that time. So we had to make sure we had staff available, and there were some times that we were really short because we had to handle the fire we had up there. But we were fortunate that we didn't have a large fire during that same time frame down here.
Was the UP fire a huge fire, not just in Michigan, but was it considered a big fire in general?
Well, certainly. You know, when you're talking 20,000 acres, even out west where you hear about the big fires, like in Colorado right now and New Mexico and those areas, this is still a big fire nationally. It's the third largest fire in the state in recent history, and I'm talking from about the 30s or 40s until now. Prior to that, of course, we had those fires from the early 1900s. But the Mac Lake fire was real close to home here, south of Mile. That was the second largest fire in that recent history. And then the Seney fire was the largest fire in this recent history, and that's up, of course, near the Duck Lake fire. And
as we just talked about before, how you know, you have to send some of the lower peninsula guys to go help up the upper peninsula. There is a group that's called the IMT. Am I getting that right? That's right, Incident Management Teams. Yes, so those teams, you send those people out there and they help coordinate and manage those big fires. Correct. Will you tell me a little bit about that? Sure. Incident Management Teams includes an incident commander, the person that's responsible for the whole team and the fire. There's plans, people that do the intelligence, they get maps out, they figure out where the fire is going to go, what the fuel types are, if it's burning in jack pine or oak or grass. They also look at weather conditions to see which direction the fire is going to go based on wind and you know, those kinds of conditions. And it includes logistics people that provide food and fuel and all those things for the firefighters to do their jobs. Public information officers that you would work with, they would work with you if you were to come up to the fire and give you information about the fire. We also have staging area managers, because when you have all those resources coming in, you have to have somebody that puts them in one location, sorts out who's there, and then lets the plans chief and the ops chief know what's available so they can send them out to the fire. So it's really a big organization to handle something as large as that. And our teams handled that. We have 4 teams across the state, 2 in the UP and 2 down here. And most of those people are already fire people. They're already doing their normal jobs, either fire or forestry work. Some folks we have from other divisions too, but so they have to step away from their normal work and then do this for a while when those kinds of fires happen. Right. Well, we're just getting started with the talk of the extensive fires, so we will talk more about that when we come back. Welcome back to Insights. I'm sitting here with Jim Fisher. Now, Jim, before we were talking about the Duck Lake fire and how extensive those were, kind of talking about, I know we're in Michigan and this is in Colorado, but the Colorado fire is huge. Right. I mean, it's kind of unfathomable how many people need to be out there and work on it. Do we send guys out there to help them out, even though they're on the west side? We do. Most years we send crews out of state, whether it's hand crews or engine crews. We've sent engines to Georgia and Oregon. We've had engines on a lot of the states. We also send single resources, overhead people like our incident management teams. We'll send folks out to help with those kinds of roles too. So we have agreements with the federal government to do those sorts of things. And yeah, the Colorado fire and fires like that, I've been on fires in Idaho where they've been 80,000 acres. So this fire in Colorado is just huge. And from what I'm seeing on the news, where it's burning houses and it's so rugged out there with the mountains and the terrain that's difficult access, and then the fires when they roll uphill, they burn so intense that they're very difficult to handle. The heat, and it's dry out there. Really and that's dry. What's different, obviously, than Michigan, because Michigan you have the humidity, and you were saying when the humidity even gets low for us, that's when we have a problem. Right. There was a refuge fire that was before the Duck Lake. It was smaller, but I mean 300 acres is still a lot, you know. What was that due to? The refuge fire is actually still under investigation. Oh, okay. We're sure it's human caused. Oh. We're just not sure exactly how right now. So we're investigating that. But it burned 300 acres. It was in the jack pine, very similar fuels to the Duck Lake fire in some areas up there. You'll see flame intensities, flame lengths coming out of that are over the tops of the trees and running with the wind. And you'll see the equipment and the folks working on the fire in the video, but
It's very, very difficult to handle a fire like that. You can't get in front of those kinds of fires. You have to keep them narrow, flank them until either the fuel changes, it gets out of the jack pine into maybe a grass or a hardwood, or it starts to cool down at night and the humidities start to come up and then the fire settles down a little bit and we can get in front of it.
Is that when the best time to fight a fire is like at night?
Not necessarily. You know, as soon as we know there's a fire, we get out there, we start working on it. And it depends on what it's burning in and how intense it's burning, you know, during the day there, how much wind is pushing it, those kinds of things. So we're going to do what we can given the conditions we have.
Maybe easiest at night.
It is easier because it's cooler at night. The humidities come up. Usually your humidities will come up into 80s or 90s, sometimes 100% depending on the night. And then the fire settles down and we can actually get in there and work on it a little bit better.
Right. Along the lines of community, how can the community help out? Obviously, there's tons of people burning during having their burn permits and burn days. Are there particular burn days, or if you get a permit, can you just burn any day you want?
Well, there's a process you have to go through to get a burn permit. You either call the 800 number or the burn permit line. I don't think it's 800, I think it's 877 or something like that. That'll be on the screen, I believe. And then there's a website also that you can go to and get your burn permit via the website. Now, you'll either see it on the website or hear it from the operator on the burn permit line, what the conditions are and whether you can burn or not. So we don't actually have burn days, but we have days that we allow people to burn.
Right.
And then they can get a permit. So we look at the weather, we look at the fuel conditions, and we say, is it safe enough today to allow people to burn their brush in their backyard? And then they can get a permit or not.
Do you post that online, or?
We do.
Okay, so people can learn that way?
Yep.
Do you have to be in a certain area? I mean, obviously, if you live in the city, you can't really have a burn day.
Right, exactly. Yeah, in cities with certain populations and within city limits, you cannot get a burn permit. And a lot of townships even have ordinances where you're not allowed to burn. The township I live in, you have to have more than 5 acres to actually burn brush. So there are some restrictions depending on where you live that we don't have control over because it's a local ordinance or it's a city.
Before you were saying how you guys take a look at the fuel and the weather conditions to allow people to, okay, this is a good day to burn. Right. Do you guys do that for fires?
We do.
And yearly fires, and because I hear when I was talking to one of the guys at the DNR in Alpena, he was saying like, oh yeah, it's there's a drought this summer, so it's high fire season. We really have to watch out. But yearly, obviously, it changes, not just seasonally. But how do you guys go about predicting those kind of things?
We have many ways that we look at weather and the fuel conditions. We work closely with the National Weather Service. We meet with them annually, and then we talk with them during certain times of the year almost daily. In the spring, we have weekly conference calls with the Weather Service to get a forecast for the next week and see what we're looking at. But we look long-term at how much moisture we've received over the last year and through the winter. We look at snowfall and how much moisture was in the snow during the winter. And we work with drought codes. The National Weather Service puts out a drought indicator out there, and we look at that. We also have weather stations of our own throughout the state that we look at for drought and see how much rain we've received. And then in the spring, as the snow melts off, everything's still brown from the fall. And until it greens up and around Memorial Day or so, those 2 months in there are usually the worst time of year for us because all the grass and leaves and needle are still brown. There's no moisture there. And if you get a drying day, you can have fires that afternoon. So we're watching the fuels, we're watching the temperature, the sunshine, the humidity, and the winds to see if those fuels are drying out. And if they dry out enough, then we don't issue burn permits, and then we staff up a little bit higher, getting ready for fires.
Do you guys ever get ahead of the fire before it even starts, of maybe spraying down water on the dry areas or whatever you guys do?
Well, no, but we do what we call fuel breaks on some of our lands, where we actually take a part of the forest, usually about 300 feet off a road, and we won't allow jack pine trees or pine trees to grow back in there. We keep it to a hardwood or a grass type, so we can actually fight the fire safer there.
Oh, okay.
So we have areas across the state where we've done some of that, and it's usually near communities so that we're protecting the community. And And then we also try to just educate the public on fire safety practices. How to get a burn permit, for instance, and then how to protect your home. Things you can do around your house.
I think that's huge.
Yeah.
I think if you were to go into some people's homes who it looks really safe to be in there and everything, but it could, I mean, there's probably possibilities, so many places that people don't realize.
Well, if you have needle litter and leaf litter all the way up to the side of your house so you don't rake your lawn, the fire in the spring will spread through those leaves really fast, and it could burn your house down because it burns right up to your house.
Wow.
Things like leaves and needles on your roof, and if a spark from a fire lands on your roof, catches your roof on fire. Those kinds of things. There is a program out there that we use called Firewise Communities, and this is a book that talks about that. It talks about, is your home protected and are you safe from wildfires? And all of our offices have that kind of information available. Or if you go to firewise.org, you can look at all that information online. And it's how to protect your home from a fire, because we're not going to stop every fire.
Right.
We have about 300 fires a year in the Lower Peninsula.
Oh, okay.
And so, we lose houses every year.
That's a lot of fires.
Yeah.
There's only 365 days a year.
That's right.
Are there any classes, besides picking up the book, I think that's great, and going online, are there any classes people at home can go take or sit in on, or...
I think we really don't have classes, but our offices have information, and when we take Smokey Bear out to...
People love Smokey
That's
Bear.
right, exactly. We take Smokey out to fairs and community events.
Okay, see, that's great.
Yeah, and so they can ask, public can ask questions there, talk to our fire staff, and get information like this from them there.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Jim, for sitting down with us today, and I know I've learned a lot about fire safety as well as the fires that we've had in Michigan. So.
Great. Thanks, Annie, for having me.
Oh, of course, anytime. So we will see you next Sunday on Insights.
Insights into Northeast Michigan has been a Channel 11 News public affairs program. If you have any comments, suggestions, or topics you would like to see on a future show, please email us at the web address on the screen. This has been a production of Thunder Bay Broadcasting Corporation. All rights reserved.